In the climate-controlled basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, beneath street level in Philadelphia, sits a clay tablet no larger than a paperback book. Its catalogue number is CBS 10673. The surface temperature in the vault hovers at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The tablet weighs perhaps 2 pounds. Its edges are chipped. Large sections are missing. What remains is covered in wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay approximately 3,700 years ago in the ancient city of Nippur in what is now southern Iraq. The tablet describes a world that existed before the gods arrived, not before humanity, not before civilization. Before the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki descended to Earth, this tablet claims there were already cities. There were already kings. There were already people living in organized settlements, practicing agriculture, raising animals, building temples. The text doesn't explain this as mythology or metaphor. It records it as chronology. First these cities existed. Then came the flood. Then the gods established kingship again, as if restoring something that had been interrupted. If you're listening to this late at night, or during a quiet commute, or as you're drifting towards sleep, wherever you are in the world right now, leave a comment with just your location and the time. We're building something here. Let's see how far this reaches. Because what CBS 10673 contains isn't simply a flood story. Every ancient culture has flood stories. This is different. This tablet, written in Sumerian, the first written language we can fully read, describes Earth's history in reverse of the order we've been taught. We've been told that civilization began when the Sumerian gods established the first cities, taught humanity agriculture and writing, created the structures of organized society. We've been told that before this divine intervention, there was only primitive humanity struggling in darkness. But the texts themselves say something else. They describe a sequence. First there were cities and kings, then came catastrophe, then the gods descended and restored what had been lost. The Sumerians themselves, in their oldest preserved writings, describe civilization not as invention, but as recovery, as inheritance, as the reconstruction of something older that the flood had nearly erased. The question isn't whether you believe this literally. The question is, why would the Sumerians write it this way? Why structure their entire conception of history around the idea that their civilization came second, that they were rebuilding, not building, that the knowledge they possessed, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, agriculture, metallurgy, had been transmitted to them rather than discovered by them? This isn't about ancient aliens. This isn't about conspiracy theories or fringe archaeology. This is about reading the actual tablets in their actual translations and noticing what they consistently claim. We're going to look at specific artifacts tonight. Real catalogue numbers, real museum collections, real excavations with documented dates and locations. We're going to examine what mainstream scholars have said about these texts, and then we're going to look at the details those interpretations struggle to explain. The CBS 10673 tablet is part of what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian creation and flood myth. It was excavated from Nippur between 1890 and 1900 by an expedition from the University of Pennsylvania. The tablet dates to approximately 1600 BC, but the language style and references suggest the story is far older, perhaps composed around 2500 BC or earlier, and copied multiple times as scribal students learned their craft. What survives is fragmentary, about 1/3 of the original text. But what remains is extraordinary, because in those surviving fragments, before describing the flood, before naming the hero Ziusudra, who survives on a boat, the tablet lists 5 cities. It names their gods, it mentions their kings, and it describes all of this as happening before the flood that nearly ended the world. These aren't cities the gods built after arriving. These are cities that already existed when the narrative begins. The text treats their existence as fact, as background information the reader would already know. Let that image settle for a moment. Clay pressed with reed stylus, baked hard, surviving nearly 4,000 years, sitting in a museum vault in Philadelphia, describing a world we've been taught never existed. We're going to spend the next several hours examining what these texts actually say about Earth's history before the Anunnaki arrived. We'll look at the archaeology that confirms some of what they claim. We'll consider the mainstream explanations for why these stories exist, and we'll explore what it might mean if the Sumerians weren't inventing mythology, but preserving memory, fragmentary, distorted by time, but memory nonetheless. The clay is cool to the touch, the script is precise, and the story it tells doesn't match the one we thought we knew, when the Earth was already old, long before the Sumerian civilization that we know from history books, before the city-states of Ur and Uruk and Lagash, before the invention of writing as we traditionally define it, before the early dynastic period that gives us our first historical kings with. Verified dates. Southern Mesopotamia was not empty. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the alluvial plain that would become the heartland of Sumerian culture, already held permanent settlements, already held communities with architecture, already held people who farmed, fished, made pottery, traded goods, and buried their dead with ritual care. Archaeologists call this the Ubaid period. It spans roughly from 5500 to 3700 BC, nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation before the Sumerians as we know them appear in the historical record. The name comes from Tel al-Ubaid, a small site near the ancient city of Ur, where British archaeologist Harry Reginald Hall conducted excavations in 1919. He found a distinct style of pottery and architecture, different from what came later, underlying the Sumerian remains. That pottery became the marker. That architectural style became the identifier. And as excavations expanded across southern Iraq throughout the 20th century, Ubaid period layers appeared everywhere, at Eridu, at Ur, at Uruk, at every major site. These weren't small camps. These weren't scattered hunter-gatherer groups. By the later phases of the Ubaid period, some settlements covered 8 to 10 hectares. They had substantial mud brick buildings. They had temples, or at least buildings that served a clear ritual function, with altars and distinctive architectural features. They had irrigation systems. They had long-distance trade networks, evidenced by materials like obsidian and turquoise that had to travel hundreds of miles from mountain sources to the flat southern plain. The site of Eridu provides the clearest picture. Eridu, according to the Sumerian king list, was the very first city where kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood. It held a special place in Sumerian thought, the city of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, the oldest settlement, the place where civilization began. When archaeologists excavated Eridu starting in 1946, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, they found something remarkable in the deepest layers. Beneath the Sumerian temples, beneath the early dynastic remains, beneath everything recognizable as Sumerian civilization, they found a sequence of 17 earlier temple buildings, one built on top of the ruins of another, each larger than the last. The sequence stretched back through the Ubaid period to its earliest phases. The first of these temples, Temple 1 in the archaeological numbering, was a small mud brick structure, perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, with an altar or offering table. Simple, but clearly intentional, clearly ritual. And then, over centuries, the community rebuilt. Temple 2 was larger. Temple 3 expanded further. By Temple the 8th, the building measured nearly 20 meters long, with plastered interior walls, multiple rooms, and elaborate buttressing on the exterior. This wasn't primitive. This was sophisticated architecture, rebuilt and expanded over generations, suggesting a community with continuity, with resources, with collective purpose. The Ubaid people left no writing. That's the archaeological barrier. We have their buildings, their pottery, their graves, their tools, but we don't have their words. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what language they spoke, though linguistic analysis of later Sumerian place names suggests a non-Sumerian substrate, words borrowed from an earlier tongue. We don't know their myths. We don't know how they explained their own existence, but we know they were there. We know they built. We know they stayed. For nearly 2,000 years, communities persisted in southern Mesopotamia, in exactly the locations that would later become the great Sumerian cities. That's not coincidence. That's continuity. The pottery tells part of the story. Ubaid ceramics are distinctive, fine buff, coloured ware, thin-walled, painted with geometric patterns in dark pigment. The designs are elegant. The vessels are well made. Production was standardised, suggesting specialised craftspeople rather than every household making its own rough containers. The same pottery styles appear from the Persian Gulf Coast in the south to northern Iraq and even into Syria and eastern Turkey, suggesting either extensive trade networks or cultural influence across a vast area. The architecture tells another part. Ubaid buildings used mud brick, the same material that would define Mesopotamian construction for millennia. They featured tripartite plans, a central hall with rooms on either side, a layout that would continue into Sumerian temple architecture. They had foundations, wall buttresses, interior courtyards. These are not trial and error structures. These are buildings whose forms had already been refined through generations of experience. And then there's the question of agriculture. Farming in southern Mesopotamia requires irrigation. The rainfall isn't sufficient for reliable crops. The rivers flood unpredictably. Success requires canals, dikes, controlled water distribution. It requires community organisation. It requires maintained infrastructure. The Ubaid settlements depended on irrigated agriculture, evidenced by their locations along ancient watercourses and by faunal remains showing diet based on farmed grains and domesticated animals. This means the Ubaid people had already solved the fundamental problem of living in southern Mesopotamia, water control. They had already developed the techniques that would allow permanent settlement in an environment that doesn't naturally support it. By the time the Sumerians appear in the written record, this knowledge is not new, it's inherited. Mainstream archaeology treats the Ubaid period as prehistoric, meaning before writing, therefore before history proper. The people are seen as Proto-Sumerians or Pre-Sumerians, a foundation culture that gradually evolved into what we recognise as Sumerian civilization. There's no mystery in this interpretation. Cultures develop over time, complexity builds gradually. The Ubaid period represents the formative stage, and the Sumerian period represents the mature flowering. But here's what that interpretation doesn't fully address. When writing does appear in the late 4th millennium BC, when the first proto-cuneiform tablets emerge from Uruk around 3300 BC, they don't show a civilization inventing its systems. They show a civilization administering systems that already exist. The earliest tablets are accounting records, lists of goods, distributions of rations, management of large institutions. The written language appears in service of complexity that's already present. There's no textual record saying, "Today we invented farming." There's no tablet explaining, "This is how we first figured out irrigation." There's no document describing the discovery of metallurgy or the domestication of animals or the principles of architecture. When writing begins, it records the management of institutions that are already functioning. It administers knowledge that already exists. The Sumerian texts themselves, when they finally do address origins, describe something different from gradual development. They describe interruption and restoration. They describe kingship being lowered from heaven after the flood destroyed the previous world. They list cities that existed before, cities where kings already ruled, where people already lived in organised communities, and they name specific locations. Those locations aren't mythical, they're real places. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. These are sites on the ground, sites with archaeological remains, sites whose deepest layers reach back into the Ubaid period. So we have a strange convergence. We have archaeological evidence of sophisticated, permanent settlements existing from 5500 BC onward. We have Sumerian texts describing cities and kings existing before a catastrophic flood. We have a gap where writing doesn't exist to bridge the two. And we have later texts treating civilization as something restored rather than invented, as something the gods re-established after disaster rather than created from nothing. The Ubaid people didn't disappear. There's no population replacement. The pottery styles gradually shift into what's called the Uruk period around 4000 BC. The architecture evolves. The settlements grow into cities. Genetically, studies of ancient Dinar from marsh areas near the ancient sites suggest continuity of population. The people who lived in Ubaid period villages were the ancestors of the people who built Sumerian civilization. But something happened between 5500 BC and 3300 BC that doesn't show up clearly in the archaeological record. Something that the Sumerians themselves, once they could write, described as catastrophe and restoration. Something they memorialized as a flood that divided the world into before and after. The land between the rivers was not virgin territory when the gods descended. It was already inhabited, already farmed, already built upon. The clay tablets that survive from later periods don't describe pioneers discovering empty wilderness. They describe the re-establishment of order in a world that had known order before. The temples at Eridu, layer upon layer, foundation upon foundation, show 1,000 years of continuous ritual practice before the Sumerians as we know them existed. Someone was building those temples. Someone was maintaining that tradition. Someone knew how to organize labour, process materials, construct architecture, and sustain a sacred site through centuries. The mainstream view holds that these were simply the precursors, the ancestors whose gradual development led eventually to Sumerian civilization. That's a reasonable interpretation. Cultures do develop. Complexity does build over time, but the texts say something different. They say there was a before. They say it was destroyed. They say it was restored. And they say all of this not as cosmic metaphor, not as symbolic teaching, but as chronology, as sequence, as the way things happened on Earth before the gods arrived to set things right again. The Ubaid pottery sits in museum storage, buff-coloured and geometric patterned. The temple foundations remain at Eridu, one beneath another, silent testimony to centuries of purpose. And the clay tablets, when they finally appear, describe a history that doesn't begin with their writing. It begins before, in cities that already stood, under kings who already ruled, in a world the flood nearly erased, the kings who ruled before heaven opened. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, housed in the collection of ancient Near Eastern artefacts, sits a clay prism approximately 8 inches tall, 4-sided, each face covered in neat columns of cuneiform script. The catalogue designation is WB444, part of the Weld Blundell collection donated by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell in the 1920s. The prism dates to approximately 2170 BC, inscribed during the reign of Utu Hegel of Uruk, though the text it contains is far older. This is the most complete version of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that attempts to provide a comprehensive record of kingship in Mesopotamia from the moment it began to the time of composition. The list moves through dynasties, city by city, giving each king's name and the length of his reign. It treats political power as a single continuous thread, passing from one city to another as dynasties rise and fall. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, the text begins. Then it lists the first kings. Then it moves to the next city, Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. And then it says, then the flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. The kings who rule after the flood have normal reign lengths, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, some shorter, some longer, but within human lifespans. They build dynasties that last centuries, not millennia. They fight wars, make alliances, construct temples. The post-flood section of the king list reads like history. Rulers whose names appear in other documents, dynasties whose archaeological remains we've excavated, events that correlate with datable artifacts. But before the flood, the text lists 8 kings who ruled 5 cities. Their reign lengths are extraordinary. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaujar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmen Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. The numbers continue through 8 rulers, culminating with Ubar-Tutu of Shuruppak, whose reign lasted 18,600 years. The total span of antediluvian kingship, according to the Weld Blundell Prism, 241,200 years. No mainstream scholar interprets these numbers literally. The consensus explanation holds that the antediluvian section is purely mythological, a sacred prehistory used to give kingship divine sanction and deep temporal roots. The enormous reign lengths serve a theological function, not a historical one. They separate the mythic age from the historical age, making clear that these pre-flood rulers belong to a different order of existence. The flood serves as the boundary marker between sacred time and human time. That's the standard reading. It's taught in universities. It appears in textbooks. It provides a tidy explanation that preserves the fundamental assumption that civilization begins after the flood, when the gods descend and establish proper order. Everything before the flood is prehistory in the mythological sense, a narrative prologue, not a record of real events. But that reading encounters immediate problems when we examine the texts more closely, because the Sumerian king list doesn't exist in just one version. We have the Weld Blundell Prism, yes, but we also have other tablets and fragments containing the same material, copied at different times in different cities by different scribes, and these versions don't agree on all the details. Another significant version is tablet WB62, also in the Ashmolean, also from the Weld Blundell collection. This is a smaller tablet, less complete, but it contains a different tradition of the antediluvian kings. Where the prism lists 8 rulers across 5 cities, WB62 includes an additional dynasty, kings of Larsa, who ruled before the flood. The names differ slightly, the numbers differ slightly, the sequence has variations. This matters. If the antediluvian section were pure invention, pure theological construct created by priests to sanctify kingship, we'd expect the tradition to be fixed. Sacred narratives tend toward consistency. Temple schools preserve official versions. Scribes copy canonical texts with exactness. But what we have instead are multiple traditions, related but not identical, suggesting different sources, different oral traditions, different regional memories that were all regarded as legitimate even though they contradicted each other in details. That pattern doesn't match invented mythology. It matches fragmentary historical tradition, accounts passed down through different channels, preserved in different cities, crystallizing into written form at different times, each community maintaining its own version of what came before. The variations don't undermine the core claim, they reinforce it. Because if the antediluvian kings were simply made up, why would different cities make up different lists? Why not agree on one official version? The text treats these pre-flood kings as operating in a different order of time, yes, but it doesn't treat them as fundamentally different in kind. They have names, they rule from cities, they perform the functions of kingship. The scribes who copied the king list didn't place a boundary marker between the antediluvian and post-flood sections saying now history begins. They presented it as continuous sequence. First these kings ruled, then the flood happened, then these kings ruled. The transition is catastrophic, but the kingship itself continues. It's restored, not invented. And then there are the cities themselves. The 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak-Sipar, Shuruppak, are not mythical locations. They're real places. Tel Abu Sharain, Tel Al-Madain, Bad Tibla, Tel Wilaya, possibly ancient Larak, Tel Abu Habar, Tel Farah Shurula. These sites have been excavated. They have archaeological sequences. And critically, they all have occupation layers reaching back into the Ubaid period. Eridu we've already discussed, 17 superimposed temples, the deepest reaching to 5000 BC or earlier. Shuruppak, excavated by German teams in the early 20th century and Iraqi teams later, shows continuous occupation from the late Ubaid period through the early dynastic. Sippar's remains are damaged by later building and looting, but show deep stratigraphy. Bad Tibera, less extensively excavated, still yields Ubaid pottery. These aren't random locations. These are the sites with the deepest roots, the longest continuous presence in southern Mesopotamia. The king list names the very cities whose archaeological records stretch back furthest. The text identifies the centres that already existed when settlement in the region began. That correlation isn't coincidental. It suggests the tradition preserved genuine memory of which places were oldest, which settlements formed the foundation of later civilization. But the enormous reign lengths still require explanation. If we're not taking 28,800 years literally, what do those numbers represent? Several theories have been proposed. Perhaps they're symbolic, using specific multiples of significant numbers in Sumerian mathematics, the sexagesimal system based on 60. Perhaps they're astronomical, encoding calendrical cycles. Perhaps they're cumulative, representing not individual reign lengths, but the total duration of dynasties or cultural periods compressed into single names. Or perhaps they represent something we don't have the context to fully understand, a different conceptual framework for measuring time, a different way of recording deep history, a numerical system that carried meaning in ways that have been lost. Ancient texts aren't always written to be decoded 4,000 years later by people from entirely different cultures using entirely different assumptions about how to record information. What we can say is this: the Sumerian scribes who maintained these lists over centuries regarded them as important. The king list was copied repeatedly. It appears in multiple cities. It's referenced in other texts. It served as a fundamental organizing principle for how the Sumerians understood political legitimacy. A king's authority was real because it stood in a chain descending from the moment kingship first descended from heaven. That chain passed through the flood, through catastrophe, through the gap that separated the deep past from the present, but it passed through. It wasn't broken. There's another detail worth noting. The last antediluvian king, Ubar-Tutu of Shuruppak, is specifically identified in other texts as the father of Ziusudra, the flood hero, the same Ziusudra who appears in the Eridu Genesis tablet CBS 10673, the man who survives the flood on a boat. The king list connects directly to the flood narrative. It places Ziusudra's father in the final position before catastrophe, making Ziusudra himself the hinge point, the figure who carries the world from before to after. If this were pure mythology, that connection would serve a clear narrative purpose, establishing continuity, showing that post-flood humanity descends from the legitimate pre-flood line. But it also does something else. It claims that someone survived who knew the old world, someone who could tell what it had been like, someone who carried memory across the catastrophe. The tradition doesn't present post-flood civilization as starting from nothing, from gods teaching blank slate humans. It presents it as restoration guided by a survivor who remembered. The Sumerian king list frustrates modern expectations of historical documents. We want clear sources, verifiable facts, dates we can carbon date and cross-reference with astronomical events. What we have instead is a text that moves between registers, between the mythological and the historical, between enormous timescales and human timescales, between the age of gods and the age of men, without signalling where the transition happens except through the flood itself. But what if that frustration comes from imposing our categories onto a text written with different purposes? The king list doesn't claim to be objective history in the modern sense. It claims to record the sequence of legitimate authority from its beginning to the present, and it locates that beginning before the flood in cities that already existed, under kings whose reigns stretched beyond ordinary human comprehension, in a time when the relationship between humans and gods operated differently than it did in the Sumerian present. The Weld-Blundell prism sits in its climate-controlled case. The cuneiform remains crisp. The text has been translated dozens of times, analysed in hundreds of academic papers, referenced in thousands of studies of ancient Near Eastern history. And what it says, when we set aside the expectation that it must be either literal history or pure fiction, is that before the flood there was kingship, there were cities, there was order, and then the flood swept over, and then kingship was lowered from heaven again, not for the first time, but again, restored to cities that already had names, that already had sacred significance, that already stood in the landscape. The post-flood world rebuilt what catastrophe had destroyed, and the text remembers, even if imperfectly, even if through numbers we can't fully interpret, that there was a before, that what came after was continuation, not beginning. The 8 kings ruled, the cities stood, and then the waters came, the 5 cities that stood before. The tablet CBS 10673 from the Penn Museum, the Eridu Genesis we've mentioned, contains a passage that survives, fragmentary but readable, naming the antediluvian cities. The translation, prepared by Thorkild Jacobson and published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, reads in part, after of kingship had descended from heaven, after the exalted crown and throne of kingship had descended from heaven, the divine rights and the exalted powers were perfected. The cities were founded sicted with names, their pure places were distributed, Eridu was assigned to leader Nudimud, Bad Tabira was assigned to the crowned prince and the sacred scribe, Larak was assigned to Pabalsag, Sippa was assigned to the gallant Utu, Shuruppak was assigned to Sud, 5 cities, each assigned to a deity, each already existing at the moment. The text establishes its chronology. The language doesn't say these cities were built, it says they were assigned, they were distributed, they were given divine patronage, not created from nothing. The grammar assumes their prior existence. This matters because it establishes a framework. Before the narrative proper begins, before the flood story unfolds, the text locates the action in a world that already has infrastructure, cities with names, sacred places already designated as pure, a landscape already organised into settlements with religious significance. The gods arrive to take up residence in places prepared for them, not to build those places from bare earth. Eridu, assigned to Enki, called Nudimud in this text, fashioner, another of his epithets, Bad Tabira, assigned to Dumuzi, the crowned prince, Larak, assigned to Pabalsag, a warrior deity, Sipar assigned to Utu, the sun god, Shuruppak assigned to Sud, later identified with Ninlil, goddess of grain and air. These aren't random locations scattered across Mesopotamia. They form a geographic cluster in the southern alluvial plain, mostly in the region that would become Sumer proper. And as mentioned earlier, they're real sites with deep archaeological records.
Let's look at what excavation has revealed at each. Eridu stands first in every list, the primordial city, the oldest, the most sacred. The archaeological site, Tel Abu Shirain, lies about 12 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur. Excavations by Iraqi and British teams between 1946 and 1949 revealed the remarkable temple sequence we've discussed, but also domestic architecture, graves, pottery kilns and trash middens, showing continuous occupation from Ubaid I, the earliest phase, around 5300 BC through the early dynastic
period and beyond. The site was abandoned sometime in the 2nd millennium BC as water sources shifted, but by then it had been occupied for over 3,000 years. The later Sumerian temple of Enki, the Abzu of the Abzu, was built directly atop those earlier temple foundations, maintaining the sacred location through millennia. Bad Tabira appears second in the king list and in the Eridu Genesis. The modern site is Tel al-Madain, about 30 kilometers east of Uruk. Large-scale excavation has been limited, but surface surveys and smaller excavations have recovered Ubaid pottery, early dynastic remains, and evidence of a substantial settlement. Later Sumerian texts identify Bad Tabira as a metalworking centre, a place where copper and bronze was smelted and worked, which fits the archaeological evidence of slag and crucible fragments found at the site. The tradition associates it with Dumuzi, the shepherd god who dies and returns, whose cult had particular importance in early dynastic religion. Lorak is the most problematic because its identification remains uncertain. The site is likely Tel Wilaya or possibly Tel al-Lam, both in the southern marshland region. Limited excavation makes chronological assessment difficult, but Ubaid pottery has been found at potential Larak sites. The city appears in god lists and temple inventories from later periods, always as an ancient and important location, but its physical remains are less well documented than the others. What we know is that Sumerian tradition consistently numbered it among the antediluvian cities, suggesting it held significance that survived in memory even as the site itself declined. Sipar occupied a special position. Located on the Euphrates River in northern Babylonia Tel Abu Habar, it was sacred to Utu Shamash, the sun god, and housed the Ibaba temple. Extensive excavation by Hormuz Rassam in the 1880s and later Iraqi teams revealed massive temple complexes from the Old Babylonian period onward, but the site's stratigraphy shows occupation reaching back to the early dynastic and Ubaid periods. Later traditions held that Sipar was where tablets of pre-flood wisdom had been buried before the catastrophe and recovered afterward, a tradition of preserved knowledge surviving disaster. The site remained important throughout Mesopotamian history, rebuilt and restored by Babylonian and Assyrian kings, who understood it as one of the oldest and most sacred locations in their world. Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, sits between the Tigris and Euphrates, about halfway between modern Baghdad and Basra. German excavations in 1902-1903, led by Robert Coldaway and Walter Andre, and later work in the 1920s and 1970s, revealed extensive early dynastic remains, including administrative buildings, residential areas, and thousands of clay tablets. The site's stratigraphy extends into the Ubaid period. Most significantly for our purposes, Shuruppak is where the instructions of Shuruppak, the wisdom text addressed to Ziusudra, originates. It's the home city of the flood hero's father, and excavations at Shuruppak found evidence of flooding in the early dynastic period, with a sediment layer separating earlier and later occupation. 5 cities. Each appears on the ground as a real location. Each shows archaeological evidence of very early occupation. Each held continuing religious importance in later Sumerian civilization, and each is named in tablets from Nippur, from from Uruk, from multiple sites across southern Iraq, where scribes copied and recopied the traditions of what existed before the flood. The mainstream interpretation treats these as the most important Sumerian cities whose primacy was projected backward into mythological time to give them sacred authority. In this view, the antediluvian tradition developed in the early dynastic or Uruk periods as a way of sanctifying the existing power centres. The cities were important in the historical period, so the tradition made them important before the flood as well, creating theological justification for their status. But this interpretation has a logical problem. If the tradition were invented in, say, 2600 BC to sanctify the important cities of that time, we'd expect the list to reflect 2600 BC political realities. Yet by that period, cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur were the major powers. Eridu was already declining, Larak was marginal, Bad Tabira was secondary. The antediluvian city list doesn't match the political landscape of any historical period we can identify. Instead, it matches the archaeological reality of which settlements were oldest. It preserves a tradition of deep antiquity that isn't obviously useful for political purposes in the periods when it was being written down. There's another detail. The gods assigned to these cities in the Eridu Genesis don't match the patron deities of later historical periods in every case. Enki remained associated with Eridu throughout Sumerian history, yes, but the others shifted. Deities changed cities, cult centres moved, religious geography evolved. The antediluvian assignments reflect an older layer of tradition that doesn't perfectly align with later practice. This suggests the tradition wasn't simply invented to justify the present, it preserves something from the past that the present had to accommodate, even when it created minor inconsistencies. Consider what it would mean if the tradition contained genuine memory. Not literal memory, 4,000 years separate the Ubaid period from the text we can read, but cultural memory passed through oral tradition, through ritual, through the persistent sacredness of particular locations. Communities don't choose randomly where to build temples. Sacred sites have continuity. The places that matter to one generation often matter to the next, even when the reasons are forgotten or reinterpreted. If Ubaid communities built the first temple at Eridu around 5300 BC, and if subsequent generations rebuilt and expanded that temple, maintaining the site's sacred significance for 1,000 years before writing existed, then the tradition that Eridu was the first city, the oldest city, the place where things began, that tradition might preserve real information, not the specific details of individual kings or dynasties, but the broad fact that this place was first, this place was oldest, this place was the foundation. The same logic extends to the other four cities. If they were among the earliest substantial permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia, if they formed the core of Ubaid civilization, if later settlements grew up around or between them, then the tradition that these 5 cities existed before the flood might encode the reality that these 5 cities existed before Sumerian civilization as recorded in texts. The flood becomes the marker of transition between Ubaid and Uruk periods, between preliterate and literate, between prehistory and history, between the time we can't fully know and the time we can partially reconstruct. The texts don't give us enough detail to prove this reading. They don't provide the kind of information that would allow verification or falsification by archaeological methods. What they give us is a consistent tradition preserved across multiple sources, claiming that civilization didn't start with the Sumerians, it started before, in these specific places, and what the Sumerians built was continuation of something older. There's a poetic passage in another Sumerian text the Lament for Sumer and Ur, composed after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur around 2000 BC. It describes the gods abandoning the cities during catastrophe. Enlil called the storm, the people moaned. He brought the evil storm, the people moaned. The land annihilating storm he called, and an Enlil called the storm, the people moaned. And then, describing Eridu specifically, in Eridu, the city where civilization originated, he caused the storm to strike in the sanctuary, the people moan. The phrase where civilization originated in Sumerian is rendered from Kiengi-Rubitar, literally from its heart, Sumer. Eridu is the heart, the source, the origin point. Even in 2000 BC, in a text mourning contemporary disaster, the scribes remembered Eridu as the beginning. Not Uruk, though it was larger and more powerful. Not Ur, the capital of the recently fallen dynasty. Eridu, the city whose importance was already fading, whose temples were ancient, whose primacy belonged to deep time. That memory persisted because it was anchored in something real, the temples beneath temples, the pottery in the deepest layers. The sense that this place had always been sacred, had always mattered, had always been first. Writing didn't invent that tradition. Writing recorded it. The 5 cities stood before the flood. The texts say so repeatedly. The archaeology shows occupation at those sites, reaching back to the earliest periods of settlement in the region. And the Sumerians themselves, when they began to write, when they began to fix their traditions in permanent form, claimed that their civilization rebuilt what those cities had begun. Not that the gods taught them, not that divine intervention created something from nothing. That specific places already had names, already had significance, already had sacred status, and that after catastrophe interrupted, those places were restored. Kingship was lowered from heaven again to cities that already existed in the landscape, waiting to be inhabited, waiting to resume their function, waiting for order to be restored. The tablet fragments sit in museums. The Tell mounds rise from the Iraqi plain, marked by millennia of accumulated occupation debris. The traditions say these places came first. The archaeology confirms they're among the oldest. And the Sumerian scribes who copied the king list, who transmitted the Eridu Genesis, who maintained the temple records, they treated this not as metaphor, not as theological invention, but as what happened, as the chronology of their world, as the foundation on which everything they knew was built. 5 cities assigned to the gods, existing before the heavens opened and the waters came. The wisdom that predates catastrophe. Among the tablets excavated from the site of Abu Salabik in southern Iraq during the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists found copies of a Sumerian text that may be the oldest example of written wisdom literature in the world. The tablets date to approximately 2600 BC from the early dynastic III period, but the language and content suggests the composition is older, possibly originating in oral form centuries earlier. The text is called the Instructions of Shuruppak, and it presents itself as the advice of a father to his son. The father is Shuruppak, king of the city of Shuruppak, one of the 5 antediluvian cities. The son is Ziusudra, who will survive the flood. The text begins, in those days, in those far-off days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far-off years. Shuruppak gave instructions to his son. Shuruppak, the son of Ubar-Tutu, gave instructions to his son Ziusudra. My son, I want to give you instructions. You should pay attention. Ziusudra, I want to give you advice. You should pay attention. What follows is a collection of proverbs, behavioural guidance, social wisdom, and practical advice. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't speak arrogantly. Don't marry a prostitute. Don't sit in the street. Don't break into a house. Respect your mother. Fear your God. Some of the instructions are pragmatic. You should not locate a field on a road. Some are ethical. You should not kill. Some are social. You should not vouch for someone. That man will have a hold on you. The content itself isn't extraordinary. Wisdom literature shares common themes across cultures. Respect authority, control your speech, avoid troublemakers, work diligently, maintain proper relationships. What's extraordinary is the framing. This isn't timeless wisdom attributed to sages or gods speaking from an eternal present. This is wisdom given by a pre-flood king to his son, who will carry it through catastrophe. The text explicitly locates itself before the world ends. The instructions exist in multiple copies from different sites. Abu Salabik, Nippur, Ur, Adab. The versions have minor variations, but the core material is consistent. Scribal schools use the text as a copying exercise for students learning to write. It was canonical, foundational, part of the curriculum that defined Sumerian education, and it was understood as pre-flood instruction, knowledge from before the catastrophe, preserved by the flood survivor and transmitted to subsequent generations. Think about what that implies. When Sumerian scribes wanted to teach students proper behaviour, when they compiled wisdom for guiding conduct, when they assembled the ethical foundation of their civilization, they anchored it in a text they believed came from before the flood, not from the gods who descended after, not from the kings who rebuilt civilization, from a human king teaching his human son how to live properly before the world changed. The text doesn't claim the advice came from divine revelation. Shuruppak speaks from his own wisdom, his own experience. He tells his son, "I have lived long, I have seen much," and offers the distilled lessons of that life. And then, though the instructions themselves don't narrate the flood, every Sumerian reader knew what came next. Ziusudra survives. The world is destroyed and rebuilt. And this wisdom survives with him. There's a peculiar quality to advice literature that claims to predate catastrophe. Modern examples help illustrate the pattern. When cultures experience trauma, war, genocide, displacement, the destruction of a way of life, survivors often report that what sustained them was remembered wisdom from before, proverbs from grandparents, skills taught in childhood, moral frameworks internalized young enough to persist even when external structures collapsed. The instruction to remember who you are in the face of forces trying to erase identity. The preservation of recipes, songs, stories, skills, not because they're practically essential, but because they're links to the world before. The instructions of Shuruppak function similarly in Sumerian culture. They represent continuity with the antediluvian world. They claim that proper behaviour, ethical conduct, social wisdom, these things weren't invented after the flood by gods teaching blank slate humans. They existed before. A human king knew them. He taught his son. The son survived. The knowledge passed through. This matters because it inverts the expected flow of civilization building narratives. In most ancient origin stories, gods teach humans how to live. Prometheus brings fire. Oens brings wisdom from the sea. Divine culture heroes provide the gifts of civilization to people who lack them. The Egyptian god Thoth gives writing. The Sumerian god Enki fashions humanity and grants them skills. The pattern is consistent. Divinity teaches humanity. But the instructions of Shuruppak show human wisdom existing independently before divine intervention. Shuruppak doesn't say, "The gods told me to tell you." He says, "I am old, I know things, listen." The authority is experiential, not divine. And that authority predates the flood, predates the descent of kingship from heaven, predates the restructuring of the world that later texts describe. There's another text that operates in the same space, the debate between silver and copper, which we mentioned earlier. It's part of a genre called Sumerian disputations, where two entities argue over which is superior. These are didactic texts, teaching rhetoric and knowledge through debate format. The debate between silver and copper, dated to around 2000 BC in its written form, but clearly drawing on older material, presents the two metals arguing their respective merits. Copper speaks first, boasting of its utility. "I am copper, the miner's prize. I provide tools for craftsmen. I make possible plowshares. I enable swords and daggers. Silver responds by emphasizing its purity and value. I am silver, beloved of gods and kings. I am weighed in scales. I serve as payment. I transcend mere utility. But what's striking is that neither copper nor silver claims to have been discovered or invented. The text assumes they're known. It assumes metallurgy already functions. It assumes a sophisticated economy where different metals serve different purposes. There's no origin story, no first I was found or thus I was smelted. The metals exist in a framework of knowledge that the text doesn't explain because the audience already knows it. This pattern appears throughout Sumerian literature. Texts about farming assume farming. Texts about irrigation assume irrigation. Texts about writing assume writing. The Sumerian literary corpus doesn't generally tell origin stories for practical technologies. It doesn't explain how humans learned to make bronze or brew beer or construct mud brick buildings. These skills exist as background knowledge, present before the narrative begins. When origin stories do appear, they typically concern divine realities, how the gods came to be, how the cosmos was structured, how cities came to have patron deities. The human-level technologies and social structures are treated as given, as already existing frameworks that the gods interact with, but don't necessarily create from nothing. The instructions of Shuruppak encode this perspective. The wisdom Shuruppak teaches isn't exotic. It's the standard moral and practical knowledge needed for functioning in organised society. Don't steal because property rights exist. Don't lie in court because legal systems exist. Respect hierarchies because social structures exist. The advice assumes the son will grow up in a world with complex institutions, established norms, recognisable social patterns. And all of this exists before the flood, before the gods descend to reorder things. If we take the text at its word, not literally in every detail, but as representing genuine tradition, then the Sumerians understood their ethical framework as inherited, not revealed. As human wisdom, tested by experience, not divine decree imposed from outside. As something that survived catastrophe because it was internalized, carried in memory, passed from father to son at the moment when the old world ended and the new world hadn't yet begun. Ziusudra receives these instructions. The flood comes. He survives. And when he emerges from the boat, when he sets foot on land that's been scoured and emptied, when he becomes the ancestor of post-flood humanity, he carries his father's words. He knows how to behave. He knows what matters. He knows the structure of proper living. And that knowledge doesn't come from the gods who are about to descend and re-establish order. It comes from the human world that was. The text concludes with a blessing. Praise be to the lady who completed the tablets, the maiden Nisaba. That Shuruppak, the son of Ubar-Tutu, gave his instructions. Nisaba is the goddess of writing and grain, patroness of scribes. The blessing acknowledges divine favour in preserving the text, but the instructions themselves belong to Shuruppak, to the antediluvian king, to the human wisdom of the world before. The gods preserved the text, but they didn't author it. That distinction matters. There's a question worth sitting with. Why would Sumerian culture structure its foundational wisdom literature this way? If the purpose were purely to sacralize the advice, to give it unquestionable authority, the obvious choice would be to attribute it to gods or divine revelation. That's the pattern most ancient cultures follow. But instead, the Sumerians attributed it to a human king who lived before the flood, whose authority rested on experience and age, and who taught his son not theology, but practical ethics. The choice suggests a different understanding of knowledge, not as gift from above, but as accumulation from experience, not as revelation, but as refinement over generations, not as the beginning of wisdom, but as wisdom's continuation even through catastrophe. When the scribal students at Nippur or Abu Salabik copied out the instructions of Shuruppak as practice, learning to form the cuneiform signs, absorbing the content as they wrote, They were being taught that their civilization's ethical foundation predated its current form. That proper behaviour wasn't invented in their lifetimes, or their grandfathers' lifetimes, or even in the historical dynasties they could trace. It came from before, from so far before that the world had ended and begun again in the interim, and yet it persisted. The tablets from Abu Salabik are fragmentary. The site was occupied only briefly, abandoned around 2400 BC. The tablets were found in what appears to have been a scribal quarter, workshops where students learned their craft. The instructions of Shuruppak were considered foundational enough to be part of that training, important enough to copy repeatedly, true enough to preserve with care. And what they preserved was the claim that human wisdom existed before the gods reordered the world, that fathers taught sons how to live properly in the antediluvian cities, that when catastrophe came, what survived wasn't just physical remnants or technological knowledge, but the ethical framework, the social wisdom, the behavioural norms that made civilization possible. Pre-flood knowledge, carried through disaster, transmitted across the gap, forming the moral foundation of everything built afterward. Not revealed, not invented, remembered, the repository beneath the waters. In Sumerian cosmology, beneath the earth, beneath the foundations of the world, lies the Abzu, a vast body of fresh water from which all springs, rivers and wells emerge. It's not simply an aquifer in the geological sense. The Abzu is personified, deified, made into both place and being. In the later Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, Apsu, the Akkadian form, is the primordial father, the sweet water, who mates with Tiamat, the salt water, to produce the first generation of gods. But in earlier Sumerian tradition, the Absu is the domain of Enki, god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and fresh water. Enki dwells in the Absu. His temple at Eridu is called the E-Abzu, the house of the Abzu, understood as the point where the divine underwater realm touches the surface world. When texts describe Enki, they locate him in the deep, in the pure place, in the subterranean water. He doesn't dwell in heaven with the sky gods, he dwells below, in the source. This spatial metaphor carries meaning. Heaven is where the great gods like Enlil reside, where political power and storm and authority emanate. The Abzu is where knowledge resides, where wisdom is kept, where the secrets of how things work are stored. Enki in the Abzu is Enki as keeper of knowledge, not knowledge in the abstract, but specific knowledge. The Me. The Me are among the most fascinating and difficult concepts in Sumerian religion. The word is usually translated as divine powers, or divine attributes, or divine decrees, but none of these quite captures it. The Me are both abstract and concrete. They're principles that govern reality, but they're also objects that can be held, stolen, transferred, possessed. A god who holds the Me for kingship can grant kingship. A god who possesses the Me for priesthood can establish priesthood. The Me are simultaneously the essential nature of something and the authority to make that thing function. The most extensive list of Me appears in a text called Inanna and Enki, where the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and convinces him to give her the Me of civilization so she can take them to a city of Uruk. Enki, in his intoxicated state, gives her over 100 Me, the Me of kingship, of priesthood, of warfare, of sexual love, of justice, of music, of metalworking, of writing, of shepherdship, of prostitution, of truth, of lies, of fear, of art. When he sobers up and realizes what he's done, he sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes to Uruk with the Me, and civilization flourishes there. It's often read as a myth about cultural transfer, explaining why Uruk became dominant over Eridu, but notice the structure. The Me already exist. They're in the Abzu, in Enki's possession, before Inanna comes asking. Enki doesn't create them for her. He doesn't discover them at her request. He has them. They're stored in his domain, in the deep water beneath the world, guarded by the god of wisdom. The me aren't new, they're pre-existing, and they encompass the entire framework of civilized life, political structures, religious institutions, artistic expressions, technological practices, social roles, ethical categories. Everything that makes a functioning complex society exists as me, as principles/objects that can be possessed and granted, kept in the Abzu until needed. Several texts describe the Abzu as containing plans or designs. The Sumerian word is gishur, which means something like architectural plan or blueprint. The world operates according to gishur, and those designs reside in the Abzu with Enki. Creation, in Sumerian thought, often involves Enki consulting the gishur, understanding the proper form of things, and then executing the plan. He doesn't invent randomly. He works from patterns that already exist in the deep. There's a text called Enki and the World Order that describes Enki travelling throughout the world, establishing the functions of each region and institution. He goes to Sumer and establishes its agricultural abundance. He goes to Meluhar, possibly the Indus Valley, and establishes its trade goods. He goes to Dilmun, probably Bahrain, and ensures its water supply. He establishes the roles of gods, the functions of priests, the operations of temples, and throughout the text emphasizes that he's organizing, establishing, assigning functions, not creating from nothing, but putting into place what belongs in place. This is Enki as administrator of knowledge, as manager of the me, as the one who knows how things work and ensures they work properly. His wisdom isn't creative genius generating novelty. His wisdom is comprehensive understanding of the patterns, the gishur, the me, the fundamental structures that make reality function. And all of this resides in the Abzu, beneath the earth, in the source waters, in the place Enki dwells. What does it mean that Sumerian cosmology locates knowledge underground, in water, in a realm that predates the current organization of the world? What does it mean that the god of wisdom is described as keeper rather than inventor, as guardian of me that already exists rather than creator of me he generates? One reading treats this as purely mythological symbolism, water as source of life, depth as mystery, Enki as personification of the life-giving and knowledge-giving properties of fresh water in an arid environment. The Abzu is metaphor for the underground aquifers that make Mesopotamian agriculture possible. The me are simply divine prerogatives personified. The whole structure is theological poetry, not cosmological claim. But there's another reading. What if the Abzu functions in Sumerian thought as a repository, a library, an archive, a storage place for knowledge from before? Not literally underwater, though the metaphor is water, but conceptually in the deep past, in the foundations, in what underlies the current world. When texts describe Enki consulting the Abzu, they often show him remembering or recalling or bringing forth, rather than inventing. When Enki creates humans in the myth Enki and Ninmah, he uses clay and divine blood, materials that already exist, and he shapes according to need, trying different forms, some successful and some flawed. It's experimentation, but it's experimentation with known materials, with techniques that function, with processes that work, because they're following patterns he understands. There's a curious detail in Inanna and Enki. After Enki sobers up and realizes Inanna has stolen the me, he doesn't say, I can just make new ones or those were copies. I still have the originals. He acts as though the me are unique, as though their loss would be catastrophic, as though they can't simply be regenerated. They have to be recovered. This suggests they're not infinitely reproducible divine will. They're specific things, limited in number, precious in a way that implies scarcity or uniqueness. If the me existed before the current arrangement of the world, if they were stored in the Abzu through whatever catastrophe separated the antediluvian era from the post-flood era, if Enki's role is to preserve them and distribute them to rebuild civilization after the waters receded, then the Abzu, as repository, makes sense. not as metaphor, but as function. The deep place where knowledge survived, the underground vault where the patterns were kept, the source from which civilization could be drawn again after disaster. Enki is consistently associated with preservation and survival. He's the god who warns the Asudra about the coming flood in the Eridu Genesis. He's the god who provides the instructions for building the boat. He's the god who ensures a remnant survives. He's described as far-sighted, as the one who knows what's coming and prepares for it. And his domain, the Abzu, is the place that survives catastrophe by being beneath, being foundational, being in the deep that waters don't destroy, because it already is water. There's a text called The Death of Gilgamesh that describes the hero Gilgamesh descending to the netherworld after death and being welcomed by the antediluvian kings. The antediluvian sages and heroes who dwell in the netherworld received him with honour. The antediluvian rulers, after the flood destroyed their world, are located in the underrealm, the place beneath, associated with water and depth, and the Abzu. They didn't vanish. They went down, into the foundations, into the place where things are preserved. This is speculative, pressing the texts beyond what they explicitly state. But the pattern is consistent. Knowledge resides in the deep. The god of wisdom dwells beneath, not above. The me that organised civilization existed before the gods distributed them to cities. The plans for how things work are stored in the Abzu and consulted when needed. And the place where antediluvian figures persist after the flood is the underrealm, the watery depth, the foundations. If you wanted to preserve knowledge through catastrophe, where would you put it? In something deep, in something foundational, in something that survives when the surface is scoured, in memory, in practice, in the bedrock understanding that persists when structures collapse. The Abzu, as metaphor for that kind of preservation, knowledge that goes so deep, it survives even when the world above is destroyed. Enki in his underwater temple, surrounded by the me, consulting the Gish-Her, preserving the patterns, waiting to distribute them again when the time comes to rebuild. Not as creator, but as keeper. Not as inventor, but as guardian. Not as the source of knowledge, but as the one who ensures knowledge has a source to return to after the waters rise and fall. The Abzu temple at Eridu, built and rebuilt over millennia, marking the spot where the Abzu touches the earth, where access to the deep repository is possible, where wisdom can be drawn from the source. Pilgrims came there for millennia. Kings rebuilt its walls and endowed its priesthood. It remained sacred long after Eridu's political power faded, because it was the connection point, the place where what survived beneath could be brought to the surface again. The texts don't explain this directly. They assume it. They reference it. They build narratives around it without stopping to define terms, because the audience already understood. The Abzu holds knowledge. Enki guards it. The me exists there. When civilization needs to be organised, that's where the principles come from. Not from innovation, from recovery, from drawing on what was placed in the deep for safekeeping. Beneath the earth, beneath the cities, beneath the memory we can access directly, the repository remains, the source, the Abzu, where the patterns were kept, where Enki dwells, where knowledge survived the flood that swept over the surface and destroyed the world that was, the powers that civilization required. The concept of the me deserves fuller exploration because it represents something unusual in ancient religious thought, a systematic attempt to catalogue and categorise the fundamental components of civilization. The me aren't vague divine forces, they're specific, they're innumerable, they're transferable, and critically for our purposes, they're treated as existing independently of the gods who possess them. In Inanna and Enki, when Enki begins handing over the me, the text lists them one by one. He gave her the high priesthood, he gave her godship, he gave her the exalted crown, he gave her the throne of kingship, he gave her the shepherdship, he He gave her the exalted sceptre. He gave her the staff. He gave her the sacred me. He gave her the descent to the netherworld. He gave her the ascending from the netherworld. He gave her the art of lovemaking. He gave her the kissing of the phallus. He gave her the loud musical instrument. He gave her the art of song. He gave her the art of wisdom. The list continues for over 100 me, covering every aspect of organised life. Political structures, kingship, governorship, judicial authority, religious roles, priesthood, temple administration, divination, prophecy, social positions, prostitution, herding, farming, craftsmanship, emotional and psychological states, rejoicing, wailing, fear, dismay, lies, art, music, practical skills, metalwork, leatherwork, building, weaving, abstract concepts, justice, truth, rebellion, destruction. Everything that exists in complex society has a corresponding me. This suggests a worldview where civilization isn't natural or automatic, but requires specific components to function. Remove the me of kingship and political order collapses. Remove the me of agriculture and food production fails. Remove the me of writing and administrative systems break down. Each me is necessary. Each me must be present and properly deployed. The text shows Enki possessing all of them in the Abzu before Inanna comes asking. He has the complete set. The entire operating system of civilization, as it were, resides with the god of wisdom in the underwater deep, and he can give them away because they're discrete, transferable objects / principles. Once Inanna has them, she possesses the ability to establish all those functions in Uruk. Enki, having given them, no longer has them, which is why he panics and tries to retrieve them. This isn't how divine power typically works in mythology. Gods don't usually run out of attributes. Zeus can grant kingship to multiple rulers without losing his own authority. Ra's power over the sun doesn't diminish if he blesses multiple pharaohs. Divine authority normally functions as abundant, not scarce. But the me have scarcity. They can be in Eridu or Uruk, but not both simultaneously. They transfer, they move, they're possessed, not simply exercised. This strange quality suggests the me represents something more like knowledge or skill than divine authority. Knowledge can be transferred. If I teach you metallurgy, you gain metallurgy. You don't just gain access to my ability to work metal, you gain the knowledge itself, which you can then exercise independently. Skills propagate. Once someone knows how to do something, they can teach others, and the knowledge spreads. But initially, someone has to know. The knowledge has to exist somewhere before it can be transmitted. If the me function like knowledge rather than like divine power, then their presence in the Abzu with Enki takes on different significance. They're there because that's where knowledge is kept. That's where the complete collection resides. When civilization needs to be established or re-established, you draw from the Abzu. You take the me that are needed and deploy them in the appropriate locations. This is administration of knowledge, curation of know-how, management of the intellectual and practical foundations that complex society requires. And the text treats this as something that was already complete before Inanna's journey to Eridu. The me weren't being generated or invented, they existed in full array. Enki possessed them all. The knowledge base was comprehensive. What remained was distribution, getting the appropriate me to the appropriate cities so those cities could function as civilization required. There's another text, fragmentary but suggestive, sometimes called the Barge of Enki, which describes Enki loading the me onto a boat and travelling to various cities, distributing specific me to each according to its role. Nippur receives the me of religious authority, receives the me of kingship, other cities receive other specialised functions. The process is deliberate, planned, organised. Each city gets what it needs to fulfill its purpose in the larger network. This looks like the establishment of a system where components already exist but need to be arranged properly to function. Not creation, but organisation. Not invention, but deployment. The me are the modules, the building blocks, and Enki is the architect who knows where each block needs to go to create a stable structure. If we take seriously the Sumerian claim that this happens after the flood, after catastrophe, then what we're watching is reconstruction. The me survived, they were in the Abzu, which the flood couldn't destroy because the Abzu is the source of water. Enki survived because he dwells in the deep, and together, God and knowledge base, they emerge to rebuild, to give cities what they need to function, to restore civilization by distributing the necessary components. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats the me as theological constructs, explanations for how the gods maintain cosmic order. The me are divine prerogatives that gods exercise to keep creation functioning properly. In this reading, texts like Inanna and Enki are myths about the distribution of divine authority among the pantheon, with political undertones about why certain cities held certain roles in Sumerian society. That's a reasonable reading for theological texts, but it doesn't fully account for the specificity and completeness of the me lists. Why enumerate over 100 discrete components? Why include not just grand cosmic principles, but also mundane practical skills? Why treat them as transferable rather than as inherent divine attributes? Why locate them all with Enki in the Abzu rather than distributing them among the pantheon from the beginning? An alternative reading treats the me as a preserved catalogue of what civilization requires. Someone, at some point in Sumerian intellectual history, sat down and systematically listed everything necessary for complex society to function: political structures, religious institutions, economic activities, social roles, emotional experiences, practical technologies, abstract values. They created an inventory of civilization's components, and they preserved that inventory in texts, in tradition, in the theological framework of the me. Why would they do that? Perhaps because they understood civilization as fragile, as something that could be lost, as something that had been lost in the catastrophe their traditions remembered as the flood. The me catalogue becomes a blueprint for reconstruction if everything falls apart, if knowledge is scattered, if order collapses. Here's the checklist. Here's what you need to rebuild. Make sure you have kingship. Make sure you have priesthood. Make sure you have agriculture, metalwork, music, law, writing. Miss one, and the structure won't function properly. The Abzu as repository, the me as catalogue, Enki as keeper. These aren't just poetic images. They're a system for preserving and transmitting comprehensive civilizational knowledge. Knowledge that predates any particular city or dynasty. Knowledge that has to be maintained centrally before being distributed. Knowledge that survives catastrophe by being in the deep, in the foundations, in the place that persists when the surface is destroyed. Modern societies maintain similar knowledge repositories, libraries, archives, universities, seed vaults, digital databases. We preserve knowledge systematically because we understand it can be lost. Natural disaster, war, cultural collapse, any of these can destroy accumulated learning. So we build institutions whose purpose is preservation and transmission. We create redundancy. We train people in the knowledge even as we store it in physical and digital forms. The Abzu functions similarly in Sumerian thought. It's where the knowledge stays. The god who dwells there is the one who remembers, who keeps the catalogue, who knows what's needed for civilization to work. When the time comes to rebuild after catastrophe, you go to the Abzu, you consult Enki, you receive the me, and you use them to reconstruct what was lost. The texts don't call this preservation of pre-flood knowledge explicitly. They present it as divine organisation of the cosmos, but the structure underneath, complete knowledge residing in one place, maintained by one keeper, distributed deliberately to rebuild civilization. That structure encodes a memory of reconstruction, of starting again with guidance from something that survived, of not inventing but restoring. The me exists before they're distributed. They're complete before any city receives them. They're preserved in the Abzu through whatever catastrophe separated before from after. And when Enki emerges to organise the world, he doesn't create the me, he gives them. He transfers what is kept. He distributes what was stored. Knowledge transmitted. Civilization restored. The components preserved in the deep, waiting for the time to rebuild. Technologies without origin stories. One of the curious absences in Sumerian literature is the lack of invention narratives for practical technologies. We have extensive mythological texts, creation stories, divine conflicts, journeys to the underworld, hymns to deities. We have wisdom literature like the instructions of Shuruppak. We have legal codes and administrative records. But we don't have stories about humans discovering metallurgy, or inventing the wheel, or first domesticating animals, or learning to brew beer. The debate between silver and copper, which we've referenced, exemplifies this absence. The two metals argue their respective merits, but neither claims to have been discovered at a particular moment. Neither says, long ago, a hero first smelted me from ore. Neither describes the invention of mining or metallurgical techniques. The text assumes metallurgy already functions. It assumes people already know how to extract copper from ore, how to smelt silver, how to work both metals for various purposes. The debate concerns relative value and utility, not origin. Beer gets similar treatment. Sumerian beer production was sophisticated, involving multiple grain types, controlled fermentation, specific brewing techniques. It was central to Sumerian economy and religion. Rations were paid in beer, temple offerings included beer, goddesses were associated with brewing. There are detailed administrative records about beer production, specifying quantities of grain, numbers of workers, output volumes, but there's no myth of the first beer, no story of a god or hero discovering fermentation, no narrative explaining how humans learned this complex process. The same pattern extends across technologies. Agriculture, irrigation, wheel making, pottery, weaving, architecture, boat building, all appear in texts as established practices. References assume knowledge. Administrative records manage production. Legal codes regulate trade. But origin stories are absent. Compare this to other ancient cultures. Greek mythology includes Prometheus bringing fire, Athena inventing the plough and loom, Hephaestus mastering metalwork. Egyptian tradition credits Thoth with inventing writing, and Osiris with teaching agriculture. Chinese tradition describes legendary emperors discovering fire-making, agriculture, and silk production. These cultures tell stories about how practical knowledge entered human experience. The Sumerians mostly don't. Their texts show civilization already functioning, with gods managing and organizing it, but rarely creating it from nothing. When creation appears, it typically concerns cosmic structures or the fashioning of humans, not the development of practical technologies. There are a few exceptions. The myth Enki and Ninmah describes the creation of humanity and touches on some civilizational elements. Enki establishes cities, assigns deities, organizes the world. But even there, the focus is organization rather than invention. Enki doesn't invent cities, he assigns gods to cities. He doesn't invent agriculture, he makes sure agricultural regions are properly blessed and productive. The text Enki and the world order comes closest to an inventory of civilizational technologies, but it presents them as Enki establishing and organizing rather than creating. He goes to Sumer and ensures its agriculture flourishes, but agriculture already exists, he's making it work properly. He goes to and establishes sheepfolds and cattle pens, but animal domestication already exists, he's organising it. The text reads like a god checking off items on a list, making sure each component of civilization is functioning correctly in its proper location. This pattern suggests a culture that understood its technologies as inherited rather than invented. The knowledge was already present. It came from before, from the antediluvian period, from the Abzu, from the deep past that preceded the current arrangement of things. Post-flood civilization didn't have to discover these practices. It had to remember them. It had to restore what catastrophe had interrupted. There's evidence for technological continuity supporting this view. Pottery styles evolve gradually from the Ubaid period through Uruk and early dynastic. There's no sudden appearance of a completely new technique. Mud brick architecture shows similar continuity, building methods refined over centuries, not invented suddenly. Irrigation systems develop in complexity but don't appear from nothing. Agricultural practices with barley, wheat, lentils, and domesticated animals are already established in the Ubaid period, continuing into historical Sumer. The technologies Sumerian texts take for granted are technologies the archaeological record shows developing over millennia in the same region. By the time writing appears to record anything, these practices have been refined through hundreds of generations of experience. They're mature technologies, sophisticated in execution, standardized in practice. They don't need origin stories because everyone knows they've been done this way for longer than memory extends. But the Sumerians did have memory extending unusually far back, their tradition of pre-flood civilization. If that tradition preserves genuine cultural memory, even in distorted form, then the absence of invention narratives makes sense. You don't tell stories about inventing what you believe you inherited. You don't mythologize the discovery of techniques you believe came from before the flood, preserved in fragmentary form, restored by survivors who remembered. The instructions of Shuruppak, remember, treat social wisdom as antediluvian. The Sumerian king list treats political organization as antediluvian. The Eridu Genesis treats cities and human social structures as antediluvian. If technologies are also understood as antediluvian, then their absence from invention myths fits the pattern. They don't belong to the post-flood world primarily. They belong to the world before, and the post-flood world recovered them. Metallurgy provides an interesting case study. Copperworking appears in the Near East around 6000 BC in the Neolithic period predating the Ubaid. Bronze, copperloid with tin, appears by 3000 BC in Mesopotamia. By the early dynastic period, bronze working is sophisticated, producing tools, weapons, vessels, and statuary. The Sumerians had clearly mastered complex metallurgy by the time they're writing texts. But how did that knowledge spread? Metalworking isn't obvious. It requires discovering that certain rocks, when heated in specific ways with specific fuels, melt and produce metal. It requires understanding ore types, temperatures, flux, casting, annealing, alloying. It's a deep body of practical knowledge developed through trial and error over generations. The conventional model holds that this knowledge developed gradually in small incremental steps, each generation adding to what the previous generation knew until eventually the full technology existed. That's how technological development typically works. But it requires continuity. It requires communities maintaining practice, passing knowledge from master to apprentice, preserving techniques even when they're not immediately useful. If catastrophic floods interrupted that continuity, not once, but perhaps multiple times, as different regions flooded at different periods, then technological knowledge becomes vulnerable. Specialized knowledge dies with specialists if it's not transmitted. Skills fade if they're not practiced. Complex techniques requiring specific conditions disappear if the conditions don't occur for long enough. But some knowledge might survive, carried by survivors remembered in fragmentary form, reconstructed through experimentation, guided by partial memory. The post-catastrophe community wouldn't have to rediscover everything from first principles. They'd have survivors who remembered that certain rocks produced metal, even if they didn't remember exact temperatures. They'd have stories about tools made from smelted copper, even if the tools themselves were lost. They'd have enough fragments to reconstruct faster than original discovery would have taken. This is speculative, pressing beyond what the texts explicitly state, but it offers one explanation for why Sumerian technological knowledge appears mature without invention narratives. The technologies weren't seen as invented during the historical period because tradition held that they came from before. The knowledge was inherited, reconstructed, refined, but not originated by the civilization that could finally write about it. When the texts do address knowledge transfer, they usually involve gods giving me to humans or to cities. Inanna brings the me from Eridu to Uruk. Enki distributes me to various locations. The me include practical skills, metalworking, leatherworking, building, farming, but they're not framed as divine inventions. They're framed as divine gifts, which implies the gods already had them to give, already possessed the knowledge, already held the catalogue of what civilization required. And where did the gods possess the me? In the Abzu, in the deep, in the place associated with preservation, with foundations, with what survives catastrophe. The place Enki dwells, the god who's repeatedly associated with ensuring survival, with warning Ziusudra about the flood, with preserving what needs to be preserved. The structure underneath these texts suggests a culture that understood itself as inheritor rather than inventor, that saw its sophisticated technologies not as recent developments but as recovered knowledge, that traced its practices back beyond historical dynasties, beyond named kings, beyond the flood, to a time when these things already existed and were practiced by the antediluvian cities. The wheel doesn't have an invention story. Beer doesn't have a discovery myth. Copper smelting appears without divine revelation. These technologies simply exist in the Sumerian world, mature and functional, because tradition held they'd always existed, or at least had existed long enough that their origins were lost in the time before the flood swept over the earth. What survives catastrophe? Not buildings, those collapse. Not monuments, those erode. Not written records, those burn or dissolve. What survives is knowledge in minds, practices in hands, traditions in communities, skills passed from parent to child, techniques maintained even when their purpose isn't immediately clear, memories that fragment into stories, stories that persist as myths, myths that preserve in distorted form the fact that something came before. The Sumerian texts, in their absence of invention narratives, in their treatment of technologies as already existing, in their framing of knowledge as transmitted from the Abzu rather than discovered through human experimentation, these texts encode a memory, not detailed, not literal, but real, a memory that what they possessed came from deeper time than they could access directly, from before the flood, from the world that was, when the waters rose over all. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms that severe flooding occurred in southern Mesopotamia at various points in antiquity. The question isn't whether floods happened. They did, repeatedly, in a region defined by unpredictable river behaviour and low-lying topography. The question is whether any particular flood event corresponds to the catastrophe Sumerian tradition remembers. Excavations at multiple sites have revealed flood deposits, layers of water-laid sediment interrupting occupation levels, indicating periods when sites were abandoned or severely disrupted. At British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s and 1930s, found a layer of clean water-laid clay over 3 meters thick in some areas. separating earlier Ubaid pottery from later Uruk materials. Woolley famously declared this evidence of Noah's flood, the biblical deluge, preserved in the stratigraphy of ancient Mesopotamia. At Shuruppak Tel Farah, German excavations in 1902-1903 found flood deposits dating to the early dynastic period, around 2900-2800 BC. The layer wasn't continuous across the site, but appeared in multiple soundings, suggesting significant inundation. At Kish, excavations by Oxford Field Museum teams in the 1920s found flood deposits at similar dates to those at Shuruppak, prompting suggestions that these represented the same catastrophic event. Subsequent analysis complicated the picture. The flood deposit at Ur dates to around 4000 BC during the transition from Ubaid to Uruk periods. The deposits at Shuruppak and Kish date to roughly 2900 BC, 1,000 years later. Other sites show flood deposits at different dates entirely. There's no single region-wide flood deposit dating to one specific moment that could be identified as the flood of Sumerian tradition. This led many scholars to conclude that the flood tradition is a generalized memory of recurring flooding, not memory of one specific catastrophic event. Southern Mesopotamia experienced destructive floods periodically. Communities rebuilt afterward. Over time, these various disasters blended in cultural memory into a single mythologized flood that separated the primordial past from the historical present. The tradition preserves the reality that flooding disrupted civilization, but not the reality of one specific deluge. That's the mainstream archaeological interpretation. It accounts for the evidence reasonably well. Floods happened at various times. Tradition amalgamated them into one mythic event. The story serves theological and cultural purposes, explaining the separation between antediluvian and post-flood eras, providing a narrative of divine judgment and mercy, anchoring later civilization in a dramatic origin story. But there's another dimension to consider. The flood tradition in Mesopotamia isn't vague, it's specific. It names the survivor, Ziusudra in Sumerian texts, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. It names his city, Shuruppak. It describes the boat, its dimensions, the animals and people brought aboard, the duration of the waters, the landfall on a mountain, the sacrifice afterward. These details aren't generic. They're narratively precise. The Eridu-Genesis, despite its fragmentary state, preserves the core narrative. The gods decide to destroy humanity with flood. Enki warns Ziusudra, who is described as pious and attentive to divine will. Ziusudra builds a boat. The text breaks off before describing the construction, but when it resumes, the flood is happening. All the windstorms and gales arose together, and the flood swept over. For 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land, and the huge boat was tossed about on the great waters. Then the sun appears. Ziusudra makes offerings. The gods grant him eternal life. He's settled in Dilmun, a paradisical land, and civilization continues through his descendants. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Akkadian copies from around 1700 BC, but clearly based on older Sumerian material, gives more detail. The gods find humanity too noisy, their population has grown too large, their activities too disruptive. Enlil decides to destroy them. Enki, bound by oath not to directly warn humans, speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing Atrahasis will overhear. He instructs him to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and animals. The flood comes. It's described in terms suggesting catastrophic storm, lasting 7 days and nights. When it ends, only the boat occupants survive. The gods, realizing they've destroyed their workforce, regret the decision. Humanity is allowed to continue, but with constraints. Disease and predation are introduced to control population naturally rather than through periodic destruction. These are coherent narratives, not vague flood mythology. They have characters, plot, motivation, consequence. They're embedded in larger cosmological frameworks that explain divine politics and human-divine relationships. and they're tied to specific geography, Shurapak as the starting point, the Persian Gulf region as the area affected, mountains to the north as the landing site. If the traditions preserve memory of an actual catastrophic flood in the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BC, one severe enough to destroy settlements, disrupt trade networks, displace populations, and break cultural continuity, then several features of Sumerian civilization come into focus differently. The period around 3000 BC marks significant changes in southern Mesopotamia. The Uruk period 4300 BC shows massive urban growth. Cities like Uruk expanding to over 5 square kilometers, monumental architecture being constructed, administrative systems developing that will lead to writing. Then around 3100-2900 BC, there's disruption. Uruk contracts. The elaborate trade networks that brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and timber from the mountains show evidence of breakdown. And then, in the early dynastic period, after 2900 BC, civilization reorganizes itself. Smaller city-states competing for resources, kingship becoming militarized. The Sumerian civilization we recognize from historical texts emerging. That sequence, growth, disruption, reorganization fits the pattern of recovery after catastrophe. Not necessarily from one single flood, but potentially from flooding severe enough, prolonged enough, or repeated enough to effectively reset the region. Settlements abandoned, agricultural land ruined by salt deposition, trade routes broken, population dispersed. The early dynastic period shows cities rebuilding on older tell mounds, reoccupying sites that had been important before. Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, these aren't new foundations, they're rebuilds. The temples are constructed atop older temple foundations. The city names persist. The sense that these places are sacred, that they have deep history, continues through the disruption. If severe flooding around 2900 BC effectively ended the late Uruk civilization, not by killing everyone, but by destroying enough infrastructure and displacing enough population that continuity was broken, then the early dynastic period is the recovery. It's when civilization rebuilds itself, when writing finally appears in full form to manage the reorganized institutions, when the traditions about before the flood start to be fixed in permanent form because now there's a medium to record them. The Sumerian king list structure makes sense in this context. The antediluvian kings represent the pre-flood world, the Uruk and late Ubaid periods, when civilization first developed large urban centres, when political complexity first emerged, when the foundations of what would become Sumer were laid. The flood represents the disruption around 2900 BC. The post-flood dynasties represent early dynastic civilization, the rebuilding, the reorganization, the conscious effort to restore what had been interrupted. The enormous reign lengths for antediluvian kings might encode the vast temporal distance between Ubaid origins 5500 BC and the flood disruption 2900 BC, 2600 years of development compressed into 8 symbolic reigns. Or they might represent something else entirely: astronomical cycles, calendrical systems we don't understand, numerological symbolism. But the basic structure remains. There was a long period before, then catastrophe, then rebuilding. The instructions of Shuruppak gain different significance if they represent wisdom literature codified in the early dynastic period to preserve what flooding had nearly destroyed. If literate culture broke down, if scribal schools were disrupted, if the knowledge transmission systems that had developed in Uruk period cities were interrupted, then when civilization reorganized itself, one priority would be fixing the knowledge in permanent form, writing it down, making sure it couldn't be lost again. The appearance of writing around 3300 BC in its proto-cuneiform form, followed by full cuneiform by 3000 BC, correlates with this recovery period. Writing doesn't appear during the Ubaid height. It doesn't appear during early Uruk. It appears late in the Uruk period and becomes standardized after disruption, as if the impetus for developing permanent recording systems came from recognition that knowledge could be lost, that memory was vulnerable, that catastrophe required a response. fix it in clay, fire it hard, make it survive. The flood traditions explicitly connect survival of knowledge with survival of humanity. Jasudra doesn't just save his family and animals, he saves himself, the carrier of memory, the one who knew the antediluvian world, the one who can teach the survivors what had been. Enki's role in warning him emphasizes that preserving knowledge is divine priority. The god of wisdom ensures someone survives who can remember. Later Babylonian tradition includes a detail not present in the Sumerian sources, but potentially reflecting older material. Before the flood, the gods buried tablets of knowledge in Sippar, one of the antediluvian cities. After the flood, these tablets were recovered and used to restore civilization. The tradition might be late invention, but it encodes the same principle. Knowledge was preserved deliberately, stored where it could survive, and recovered when the time came to rebuild. Archaeology can't prove a single catastrophic flood. The evidence is ambiguous. Multiple floods at different times, local rather than regional disasters, recovery rather than total destruction. But archaeology does show disruption around 2900 BC, followed by reorganization. It shows cities rebuilt on older foundations. It shows technologies continuing with refinement, but without reinvention. It shows writing appearing in the context of administrative reorganization, as if recording and managing resources became urgent priorities. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this sequence. Civilization before, catastrophic flood, survivor preserving memory, gods descending to restore order, cities rebuilt, kingship lowered from heaven again, knowledge distributed from the Abzu where it survived, the world reorganized according to patterns that already existed, that were remembered, that were drawn from the deep to remake what had been lost. Whether the flood was single event or amalgamated memory, whether it was literal deluge or symbolic representation of cultural collapse, the tradition remembers interruption. It remembers that what came after had to consciously rebuild. It remembers that the rebuilding wasn't invention but restoration, not discovery but recovery, not creation from nothing but reformation according to patterns preserved from before. The waters rose, the world was scoured, and then, from what survived in the deep, from what was kept in the Abzu, from what the keeper of knowledge preserved, civilization was restored, different in details perhaps, adapted to new conditions, but continuous with what had been, inheriting its foundations from the world the flood had swept over, the throne lowered twice. A peculiar phrase appears repeatedly in the Sumerian king list and related texts. Kingship was lowered from heaven, not established, not invented, not created, lowered. The Sumerian verb ed suggests descent from above, something being brought down from a higher realm to earth. After the flood, when civilization begins again, kingship was lowered from heaven and given first to the city of Kish. But earlier in the same text, before describing the antediluvian kings, another phrase, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The same action, lowered, descended, brought from the divine realm to the human world. Before the flood, kingship was lowered to Eridu. After the flood, kingship was lowered to Kish. Twice. Kingship descends from heaven twice. This creates an interpretive problem. If kingship is granted by the gods at the beginning, why does it need to be granted again after the flood? If the gods establish political order in the primordial past, why must they re-establish it after catastrophe? The standard explanation holds that the flood destroyed everything, including political structures, so the gods had to start over, kingship had existed, was lost, and was restored. But notice what that implies. Kingship existed before the flood. Political organisation, the institution of centralised authority, the structures that govern human communities, these existed in the antediluvian world. They weren't post-flood inventions. They were antediluvian realities interrupted by catastrophe, then restored when civilization rebuilt. The text doesn't present post-flood kingship as a new idea the gods have. It presents it as the same institution, the same office, the same concept, now being lowered again because the first instantiation was destroyed. The pattern from before is being re-implemented. The structure that worked before is being set up again. This becomes even more explicit in texts describing individual post-flood kings. When early dynastic rulers claim legitimacy, they don't just claim divine approval. They claim to stand in a line extending back through the flood to the first kings. The king of Lagash or Ur or Uruk isn't starting something new, he's continuing something ancient. His authority is real because it connects to the original descent of kingship from heaven, the one that happened at the beginning, before the flood, when Eridu first received political order. One text from the early dynastic period, a fragmentary inscription of a ruler named Enshakashana, claims dominion over territories and concludes by stating his authority derives from Enlil, who put all lands in his hand when kingship was lowered from heaven. The phrase appears in the context of current political authority, but references the primordial event. The king's power now depends on the gods having established kingship then, back at the beginning, back when things were first organised. If kingship was purely a post-flood institution, if political organisation didn't exist before catastrophe, there would be no need for this double framing. The texts could simply say, kingship began after the flood, full stop. But they don't. They insist it was lowered once, then the flood came, then it was lowered again. Before and after. First pattern, then disruption, then restoration of pattern. The antediluvian king list includes details suggesting these were functioning rulers, not just symbolic figures. They have names. They rule from specific cities. The text records reign lengths for each, however we interpret those numbers. They are presented as performing the duties of kingship, governing cities, maintaining order, interfacing with the gods. This is political organisation in operation, not political organisation as abstract concept. The archaeological evidence for political complexity in the Ubaid and Uruk periods supports the idea that organisational structures existed long before writing records them. Ubaid settlements show evidence of central planning, irrigation systems requiring communal labour, temple construction requiring resource mobilisation, long-distance trade requiring coordination. Someone was organising that labour. Someone was managing those resources. Someone was making decisions that entire communities followed. By the Uruk period, the evidence becomes overwhelming. The city of Uruk around 3500-3000 BC covered over 5 square kilometres, with population estimates ranging from 40,000 to 80,000 people. The Anna temple complex occupied an enormous area, with multiple massive buildings decorated with elaborate mosaics. Such a city requires administration, food distribution, labour organisation, conflict resolution, resource management. That's kingship, whether or not we have texts naming the kings. The Uruk period chief priest, or En, was probably the precursor to what early dynastic texts call lugal. The role combined religious and political authority, managing temple resources that were effectively the city's economy. When writing first appears in proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk around 3300 BC, it's recording administrative transactions for these temple institutions. Grain distributed, animals counted, labour assigned. The system is already functioning. The tablets record its operation. Then comes the disruption around 3000 to 900 BC. Uruk contracts. The elaborate temple complexes are rebuilt on smaller scales. The trade networks falter. And when early dynastic civilization emerges after 2900 BC, the political organisation has changed. Instead of single dominant cities, there are multiple competing city-states. Instead of temple-centred economy, there's palace-centred authority. The Lugal is now clearly a military king, not primarily a religious figure. The system has been reorganised. The texts describe this reorganisation as kingship being lowered again, restored after disruption. And they claim that this restored kingship connects to the antediluvian pattern, that it's the same institution being re-implemented, that the authority of early dynastic kings derives from the authority of kings who ruled before the flood. If the tradition contains genuine cultural memory, if the flood represents real disruption around 2900 BC, then what we're seeing is political reorganization after catastrophe. The early dynastic city-states are rebuilding political structures that existed before, not identically, but following remembered patterns. Kingship isn't a new invention. It's restoration of an old institution that had functioned in the Uruk and late Ubaid periods, was interrupted by flooding, and was consciously re-established as part of civilizational recovery. The emphasis on kingship being lowered from heaven serves an important function. It claims that political authority isn't just human power grab. It's divinely sanctioned, part of the cosmic order established by the gods themselves. This gives kings legitimacy. It makes rebellion against the king rebellion against divine will. That's standard ancient Near Eastern political theology. But the specific framing, lowered twice before and after flood, does more than just sanctify political power. It claims continuity through catastrophe. It says the political order of the present connects to the political order of the deep past, separated by disaster, but fundamentally the same. Post-flood kings aren't innovators. They're restorers. They're re-implementing patterns the gods established at the beginning. This matters for how Sumerian civilization understood itself. They didn't see themselves as the first civilization, the inventors of political organization, the creators of urban life. They saw themselves as inheritors, as people rebuilding what had been built before, restoring what had been interrupted, continuing traditions that extended back before memory, before the flood, before the current age of the world. The city names persisted. Eridu didn't vanish from the landscape. When early dynastic civilization crystallized, Eridu was still there, still sacred, still recognized as the first city. The tradition that kingship had first been lowered there maintained itself through whatever disruption separated Ubaid Uruk from early dynastic, because the place was still there. The Tel Mound was still standing. The temple foundations were still visible beneath later construction. The physical continuity of place anchored the memory of what had happened there. The same applies to the other antediluvian cities. They weren't mythical locations invented to populate a creation story. They were real places, still occupied, or at least still identifiable in the landscape, whose antiquity was obvious from the depth of their archaeological tells. When early dynastic scribes listed the antediluvian cities, they were naming sites that everyone knew were old, whose temples showed evidence of reconstruction over long periods, whose sacredness was acknowledged even by cities that had surpassed them in political power. Kingship was lowered from heaven to these places. Then catastrophe came. Then kingship was lowered again to new centres, Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, the competing dynasties of early dynastic politics. But the lowering wasn't origination, it was restoration. The gods weren't inventing political order, they were re-implementing it, setting it up again, making sure the necessary structures of civilization were put back in place after flooding had swept them away. The pattern matters as much as the specific form. What the texts preserve is the principle that civilization before the flood was organized, had political structures, had centralized authority, and that civilization after the flood consciously modeled itself on that previous organization, not inventing from scratch, but restoring according to remembered pattern, not beginning but continuing. Kingship lowered twice, once to establish, once to restore. The institution crossing the boundary of catastrophe, anchored in divine authority, granted before the flood and granted again after, maintaining continuity even through interruption. The throne descended from heaven. Eridu received it. The antediluvian kings ruled. The flood came. The throne descended again. Kish received it. The early dynastic kings ruled, and both, the rulers before and the rulers after, stood in the same line, held the same authority, exercised the same divinely sanctioned office. separated by catastrophe but united by continuity. The same kingship, lowered twice, because the pattern was worth preserving, because the gods knew how civilization should be organized, because what had worked before should work again. 3 ways to read silence. We've examined the texts, we've looked at the archaeology, we've traced the traditions. Now comes the harder question: how do we interpret all of this? What do these Sumerian texts actually tell us about Earth's history before the Anunnaki descended to establish order? The mainstream scholarly consensus offers one answer. The antediluvian traditions are purely mythological. They serve theological and political purposes, providing divine sanction for kingship, explaining the relationship between humans and gods, justifying the primacy of certain cities, creating a sacred history that gives Sumerian civilization deep temple roots. The flood serves as a boundary marker between mythic time and historical time. Everything before the flood is symbolic. Everything after can potentially be historical. The enormous rain lengths, the claim of pre-existing cities, the description of kingship being lowered twice, these are narrative devices, not factual claims. In this reading, the traditions tell us about Sumerian ideology, not about actual history. They reveal how the Sumerians wanted to understand themselves, not how things actually happened. The texts are valuable for what they show about ancient thought, but they're not evidence for pre-flood civilization in any literal sense. The cities were important in the early dynastic period, so the tradition projected their importance back to primordial time. Political authority needed legitimacy, so the tradition claimed it descended from heaven. Catastrophic flooding was a real threat in Mesopotamia, so the tradition incorporated it into the culture's origin narrative. This interpretation accounts for the evidence reasonably well, and it avoids claims that would be difficult or impossible to verify. It's the safe reading, the academically sound reading, the one that doesn't require positing events we can't prove happened. But there's a second reading, less common in mainstream scholarship, but present in some anthropological and comparative approaches. This reading treats the texts as encoding genuine cultural memory that has been mythologized. In this view, the Sumerian traditions preserve real information about the past, but filtered through mythological frameworks, distorted by time, interpreted through theological lenses that were developed later. The flood becomes memory of real catastrophic flooding that disrupted civilization around 3000 to 900 BC. The antediluvian cities represent actual pre-flood settlements, the oldest in the region, whose antiquity was remembered even when specific historical details were lost. The claim that kingship existed before the flood encodes the reality that political organization had developed in the Uruk and Ubaid periods before disruption. The enormous rain lengths represent deep time, the vast stretch between first settlement and the flood, compressed into symbolic numbers. This reading doesn't accept the texts as literal history. It doesn't believe individual antediluvian kings ruled for 28,000 years, but it believes the traditions preserve something real, a memory that civilization developed over very long time periods before writing existed to record it, that catastrophic events disrupted that development, and that the post-flood civilization consciously saw itself as continuing and restoring what had been interrupted. The mythological language is the medium of transmission, but underneath is genuine historical memory. This interpretation explains some features the purely mythological reading struggles with. Why the antediluvian city list doesn't match later political realities, why technologies appear without invention narratives, why the texts treat civilization as restoration rather than creation. Why the same cities that appear in the antediluvian lists show archaeological evidence of the earliest and deepest occupation in the region, but it remains fundamentally cautious. It doesn't claim we can extract detailed historical facts from mythological texts. It acknowledges the texts have been shaped by theological purposes, edited and recopied over centuries, embedded in cultural contexts we only partially understand. What it claims is that completely dismissing the historical dimension might be premature. The texts might preserve fragments of real memory, however distorted, about a pre-literate past that we have no other way to access. Then there's a third reading, more speculative, less accepted in academic contexts, but worth considering for completeness. What if the texts mean more or less what they say? What if the Sumerians were attempting to record, as accurately as their conceptual frameworks allowed, a history they believed to be true? What if the antediluvian traditions aren't mythological projection backward, but genuine attempts to preserve knowledge about a world that existed before? This reading takes seriously the Sumerian claim that civilization existed before the flood, that it was sophisticated and organised, that it possessed advanced knowledge, and that post-flood civilization deliberately restored what had been lost. It treats the texts as historical documentation, not in the modern sense, not meeting modern standards of evidence and verification, but historical in intent. The Sumerians writing these texts believed they were recording what had actually happened, what their ancestors had remembered and transmitted, what the survivors had told. The enormous reign lengths might encode something we don't understand, different timekeeping systems, different concepts of rulership spanning generations, different ways of measuring authority that don't translate to individual human lifespans. Or they might be symbolic, but the core claim that kings ruled organised cities before the flood would be accepted as true by the ancient scribes who copied these texts. The gods descending to re-establish order after the flood might be, in this reading, the way Sumerian culture explained the reorganisation of civilization, attributing to divine agency what was actually human effort guided by preserved knowledge, using theological language to describe cultural processes. Or it might be something else, something we lack context to fully interpret. This reading doesn't require belief in ancient aliens or lost super civilizations or anything that contradicts established archaeology, but it does require entertaining the possibility that urban civilization in Mesopotamia is older than conventionally believed, that sophisticated social organisation developed earlier than writing records, that catastrophic flooding disrupted development severely enough that the post-flood world had to consciously reconstruct what had been, and that Sumerian texts preserved genuine tradition about this process, even if filtered through mythological language. The archaeological evidence doesn't disprove this reading. Ubaid civilization shows sophistication and continuity from 5500 BC onward. Uruk period cities show massive scale and complexity by 3500 BC. Disruption around 2900 BC shows in the archaeological record. Early dynastic civilization shows conscious rebuilding on older foundations. Nothing in the physical evidence contradicts the basic pattern the texts describe: civilization before, catastrophe, civilization after, conscious continuity between them. What's lacking is direct evidence proving the pattern. We don't have pre-flood written records saying this is what our civilization looks like before catastrophe. We don't have unambiguous archaeological proof of a single catastrophic flood that fits the chronology. We don't have independent verification of the antediluvian kings or dynasties. We have traditions claiming these things, and we have archaeological patterns consistent with them, but not proof. So which reading is correct? The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. Each reading has strengths and weaknesses. Each accounts for some evidence better than others. Each makes different assumptions about how to interpret ancient texts and what weight to give to tradition versus archaeology. The purely mythological reading is safe and academically defensible, but it may be too dismissive of cultural memory's reliability over long time spans. The encoded memory reading is more generous to the tradition, but it risks over-interpreting texts whose purposes we may not fully grasp. The documentary reading is most generous to the texts, but it requires accepting claims that are difficult to verify and that push against conventional chronologies. What we can say with confidence is this: the Sumerian texts consistently claim that civilization existed before the flood, that it was organized and sophisticated, that knowledge and social structures existed in the antediluvian world, and that post-flood civilization understood itself as continuing and restoring what had been interrupted, whether that's purely theological construct or distorted cultural memory or genuine historical tradition preserved across catastrophe. We're left to weigh the evidence and decide which interpretation best accounts for what survives. The texts don't insist we believe them literally, but they do insist that civilization, as the Sumerians knew it, was continuation, not beginning. That their knowledge came from before, not from invention in their present. That the cities they inhabited had roots reaching back through the flood to the world that was. And that the gods who descended to organize things were organizing according to patterns that already existed, that were remembered, that were preserved in the Abzu and brought forth again when the time came to rebuild. 3 ways to read, 3 frameworks for interpretation, and between them, space to acknowledge mystery, the simple fact that we're separated from these events by millennia, by catastrophe, by the loss of context and language and understanding, and that our certainty about what really happened has limits. What remains is the clay, pressed with reeds, fired hard, surviving, and the words pressed into that clay, insisting that there was a before, that the flood divided it from after, and that what came after remembered, the knowledge that survived. Return with me now to the Penn Museum vault, to tablet CBS 1673, to the fragmentary text we began with. The clay is cool, the script is precise, 6 columns, 3 on each side, partially destroyed but readable enough to recover the narrative, a story of cities existing before the flood, of kingship already established, of the god Enki warning a human king that catastrophe was coming, of survival through planning and preparation, of the world continuing through a remnant who remembered. It sits on a shelf, catalogue number visible, alongside thousands of other tablets from Nippur and other excavations, accessible to researchers, available for study. The text has been translated multiple times, analysed extensively, incorporated into the scholarly record of Sumerian literature. It's not hidden, it's not suppressed, it's simply there, saying what it says, available to anyone willing to look. What it says is that the world the Sumerians inhabited wasn't the first world. That civilization, as they knew it, built on foundations laid before catastrophe. That the cities they called sacred were sacred because they were old, truly old, reaching back beyond the flood into the time that preceded it. That their technologies, their social structures, their political institutions, their ethical frameworks weren't invented in their historical dynasties, but inherited from deeper time, refined and restored, but not originated. This isn't a claim the modern world is required to accept. The evidence is ambiguous enough that multiple interpretations remain viable. The text can be read as mythology without remainder, as theological constructs serving cultural purposes with no historical referent needed. That's a legitimate reading. It's the dominant reading in academia. It's defendable, but it's not the only possible reading. And insisting it's the only possible reading requires dismissing the Sumerians' own understanding of their past, requires treating their historical traditions as fabrication or fantasy, requires assuming they were incapable of preserving genuine memory across the spans of time involved. That might be correct. Memory does distort. Oral tradition does mythologize. Time does erase detail, but dismissing the tradition entirely carries its own risks. The risk of intellectual arrogance, of assuming we understand their texts better than they understood their own past, of privileging our frameworks over their testimony. What if we simply sit with the uncertainty? What if we acknowledge that the Sumerian texts preserve something, whether accurate historical memory or mythologized cultural memory, or pure theological invention we cannot finally determine, about a past that preceded the civilization we can document through writing? What if we allow that Ubaid period communities building temples at Eridu for 1,000 years before Sumerian texts exist possess their own forms of knowledge, their own social complexity, their own understanding of their place in the world? What if we entertain the possibility that when those communities were disrupted by flooding severe enough to break continuity, the survivors remembered and transmitted and preserved fragments that later Sumerian civilization incorporated into its own foundation narratives? We don't have to claim certainty, we don't have to insist on literal interpretations, but we can remain open to the possibility that the texts tell us more than just what the Sumerians believed, that they might tell us in distorted form something about what actually happened, that beneath the theological language, beneath the symbolic numbers, beneath the mythological framing, there might be genuine historical tradition, not provable by archaeological standards, not reducible to dates and names and verifiable events, but real nonetheless. Memory, fragmentary and uncertain, but memory. The Sumerians themselves seemed to believe this. They treated their traditions as having historical grounding. They maintained them with care, copying them repeatedly, incorporating them into their canonical literature, teaching them to scribal students generation after generation. They didn't frame these as myths our ancestors invented. They framed them as what happened before, how things came to be, the history that precedes us. That might be self-deception. Cultures tell themselves stories about glorious pasts that never existed. National mythologies project back golden ages that are purely imaginary. Sacred histories serve present purposes, not past accuracies. All of that is true and well documented, but it's also true that some cultural memories preserve real information across vast time spans, that oral traditions can maintain surprising accuracy across dozens of generations. That places, when continuously inhabited, anchor memories that persist even when details are forgotten. That catastrophes leave marks deep enough that they're remembered long after the specifics fade, and that communities rebuilding after disaster consciously preserve what they can, deliberately maintain traditions, specifically choose to restore rather than invent, because connection to what was matters to them. The Sumerians, when they began to write, when they first fixed their traditions in permanent form, chose to record that their cities had existed before the flood. They chose to claim that kingship had been lowered from heaven twice. They chose to locate the source of their knowledge in the Abzu, the deep, the place that survived catastrophe. They chose to present their civilization as continuation, as restoration, as the rebuilding of what had been interrupted. Those choices might be purely ideological, or they might encode something real. We're left to decide, with incomplete evidence, with ambiguous texts, with archaeology that confirms some things but leaves others uncertain, which interpretation we find most compelling. There's no proof. There's no way to finally settle the question, but there is the invitation to wonder, to question, to remain open to possibilities our current frameworks might not fully accommodate. The tablet sits in its vault. The tell mounds rise from the Iraqi plain. The rivers still flow, though in different channels than they did 4,000 years ago, than they did 6,000 years ago. The sites are there, some excavated, some not, some damaged by modern conflict or ancient erosion, but there, marking locations that were already ancient when the Sumerians began to write about them, already sacred, already freighted with traditions extending back beyond accessible memory. What happened there in the deep past? What civilizations rose in the Ubaid period, developed their own forms of complexity, built their own monuments, accumulated their own knowledge? What did catastrophic flooding destroy around 2900 BC? What fragments survived, carried by survivors, maintained in oral tradition, preserved in practice, guarded by communities who understood that something precious had been lost and must be protected? What did early dynastic civilization restore, rebuild, reconstruct when it organised itself in the cities whose foundations reach back to Ubaid times. We ask these questions without definitive answers. We examine the evidence, textual and archaeological, and find suggestive patterns but not proof. We read the Sumerian texts and see claims that are either mythological projection or historical memory, and we cannot finally determine which. The mystery remains. The uncertainty persists. But that's not failure. That's honesty. That's acknowledging the limits of what we can know while remaining curious about what might be true. The Sumerians claimed their civilization inherited knowledge from before the flood. Maybe that's pure mythology. Maybe that's distorted memory. Maybe, just maybe, it's closer to literal truth than we've been willing to consider. We don't have to decide finally. We can hold multiple possibilities in tension. We can remain open. We can question. The knowledge that survived, if any survived, is fragmentary. The texts are broken. The tablets are partial. The traditions are filtered through millennia of transmission. But fragments can be meaningful. Partial evidence can be suggestive. Distorted memory can still point towards something real. And the invitation the Sumerian texts extend is simply to consider, what if our civilization isn't the first? What if knowledge we possess was possessed before? What if catastrophe interrupted rather than initiated? What if we're continuing, not beginning? Those questions don't have easy answers. They might not have any answers we can access with available evidence, but they're worth asking. Because in asking, we do what the Sumerians themselves did. We remember that our present connects to a past that's deeper, older, more complex than simple narratives suggest. We acknowledge mystery. We honour what's been lost. We preserve what fragments we can. And we remain curious about what came before, what survived, what knowledge might have been carried across catastrophe to reach us, distorted but not erased, fragmentary but not destroyed. The vault is climate controlled. The tablet is preserved. The words pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago remain readable. And what they tell us, however we interpret it, is that there was a before. That cities stood. That knowledge existed. That catastrophe came. That survival was possible. That memory persisted. And that what we call the beginning might have been continuation, might have been restoration, might have been the rebuilding of something older that the flood had swept over but not entirely destroyed. Consider that. Question it. Weigh the evidence. Decide what you find compelling. But don't dismiss too quickly. Don't let certainty close off curiosity. The texts are there. The archaeology is there. The mystery is there. And somewhere in the intersection of what the Sumerians claimed and what the earth reveals, there might be truths about our past that we haven't fully grasped yet. The knowledge that survived, if any did, is waiting to be understood. The fragments are there to be assembled. The questions are there to be asked. And the invitation remains, look at the oldest texts we can read. Notice what they actually say, and wonder whether they might be telling us something true about Earth's shocking history before the Anunnaki arrived to reorder the world that was. The tablet sits in its vault, cool and precise. The answers, if there are answers, lie deeper still, in the Abzu, in the foundations, in the place beneath memory where the patterns were kept, where Enki dwells, where the me survive, where the knowledge of what was remains, waiting for those curious enough to dive beneath the surface and recover what the flood couldn't fully destroy.